Welcome, everyone. I'm Heba Atwa, and I'm here with my colleague, Susie Kachaturian. And we are with the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center. We're a 501c3 with a special emphasis on the North Carolina tax code and state budget, specifically working to advance inclusive public policy solutions to poverty and racial equity. Today, we're going to talk about the impact the budget has on our daily lives and how we can be a part of building a better, more inclusive and equitable budget process. Susie will speak later on in the program about more about what we can expect from this year's budget process later on in the presentation. And we're so excited to be joined today in this conversation by our partners, Sailor Jones of Common Cause, Reverend Lisa of the United Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of North Carolina and the People's Budget Coalition, Jovita Lee of North Carolina Black Alliance, and Susan Book from Every Child NC. Thank you, partners, so much for being with us. So our state budget is absolutely foundational for our quality of life. It's foundational to the exercise of our rights and our ability to live with dignity. Our budget is derived from the wealth our work creates in the form of taxes, and democratic and inclusive distribution of those dollars are what will ensure a budget that provides every North Carolinian an opportunity to thrive. So Mel, if you'll advance the slides. Our budget is a mathematical representation of what issues, communities, and people are most important to our budget crafters, to whom opportunity is afforded and to whom it is not. This was true when Baird Rustin and A. Philip Randolph worked with economists and civil rights leaders to create the Freedom Budget more than 50 years ago, and we absolutely know it to be true today. However, the budget process is becoming increasingly opaque. It's the practical tool with which we secure the opportunities that ensure thriving families, communities of opportunity, and full participation in a multiracial democracy. But increasingly over the last several years, the process is becoming more and more opaque and politicized, leaving the budget a political weapon that does not provide adequate funding for crucial programs and services in our state. We have seen a steady increase in this lack of transparency. For example, our lawmakers have less time to review the budget contents before voting. Arbitrary spending limits don't reflect the real needs of our state and communities, and decisions being made behind closed doors, meaning that the public has no input into spending decisions that, again, are foundational to our quality of life now and for decades to come. We are all impacted by the budget process, from the investments in internet infrastructure and utility infrastructure that help us connect today to the roads we drive on, schools our children attend, and so much more. Building a better budget process means more transparency. It means equity in our tax code. It means making clear how public investment can lead to more equitable anti-racist outcomes. So taxes are foundational to our budget, the revenue that we generate. And of increasing importance is equity in our tax code. Since 2013, NC legislative leaders have been reducing the tax rate on income and making changes that have shifted the tax load from the wealthy to those with lower wages. So increases in the standard deduction or the threshold of income upon which the income tax rate is applied for most tax filers have not addressed the lower tax load carried by the richest 5%. Low and middle income North Carolinians now pay a total higher effective tax rate than wealthier North Carolinians because of sales and property taxes. The reduction in revenue tax cuts brings mean we'll have fewer dollars available than we need to meet necessary spending. And this is just if the bare minimum is met. This is while our state is projected to grow by more than 3 million people over the next 30 years. Moving on to eliminating the corporate income tax. North Carolina used to require profitable corporations to pay a rate of almost 7%, but that has steadily been chipped away to only 2.5% now. And what's more, the budget that lawmakers passed in 2021 included the scheduled rate to go down to 0 by 2030. What's more is these tax cuts have not delivered on their promises of tremendous job creation. North Carolina has fallen behind some of our closest neighbors. For example, between 2014 and the start of COVID-19, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee all created jobs at a faster clip than North Carolina. And looking back even further, North Carolina has lost the lead it held over many of our peers in the Southeast. Of our immediate neighbors, only Georgia created jobs at a faster clip than our state between 1990 and when these tax cuts were initiated. As an example, California, that actually increased taxes on rich people to fund their recovery from the Great Recession, at the same time that our North Carolina leaders were slashing taxes on the wealthy and profitable corporations, California added jobs significantly faster between 2014 and the start of COVID-19. So as North Carolina increasingly competes for high-tech jobs and the workers we need to do them, we'll need to boost investments in education, research, development, digital infrastructure, and social amenities like parks. Or of course, we risk losing the gains made over the past several decades. And of course, that's where our state budget decisions come in. Now, I'd like to pause from the presentation and turn it over to our panelists. The budget, as I mentioned, is foundational to our quality of life, from the air we breathe, water we drink, the education our kids receive, and whether or not our elections remain free and fair. So panelists, welcome. Again, we're so happy to have you. Thank you for being here. So my first question for you is, procedurally, how does the state budget interact with the funding for your issue? So I'm going to turn it over to you first, Saylor.
Thank you, my friend, and really appreciate Budget and Tax for letting us be here today. As most of you know, and I'm here to talk about elections. Elections are funded at the county level in North Carolina. Boards of county commissioners appropriate the fiscal year funds necessary to hire and pay election staff, rent polling places, replace or repair voting machines, order supplies, and all of the basic functions that are the backbone of our democracy here in North Carolina. So local budgeting impacts a lot of that, dictating election experiences, allowing for better access for young and rural voters, for example, when we have more spots to vote. And even though that happens, more than 2/3 of North Carolina's counties spend less than the national average on elections. So a lot of elections problems we see aren't just about fraud, or they aren't about fraud at all. It's about funding. And many of the voting problems we experienced as recently as 2022 can be attributed to a lack of election investment at all levels. That is true at the state level as well. There are laws that have been proposed this year during the long legislative session that would do things like cut private funding for our elections. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because in 2020, the last presidential cycle, 97 of 100 counties took that private funding to shore up what the counties could not offer in that budget cycle. So when the state proposes to cut that funding, inevitably legislative leadership are cutting the funding in their own rural hubs for their own constituents and for their own voters who elected them as recently as 2022. We also know they've been dragging their feet a bit about providing HAVA funds and other federal funds that have been appropriated for the state and need only be matched. And these are only millions of dollars. In some counties, they already set that amount aside for this type of budget. So even the smallest amount coming from the federal government, the state has kind of dragged its feet to make impossible. The state has also found other insidious ways beyond just the state budget to cut elections fundings. A few years back, they implemented a bill that would require uniform weekday hours, many of the hours that are least popular for voters, thereby draining the coffers for the more popular voting hours on the county levels, and leading to dramatic cuts for popular weekend hours, including Saturday and Sunday voting that is most popular in counties across the state. So when the state does not set aside that money for elections, they do so at the detriment of their own voters. And this is going to be an important rallying cry for many groups like Budget and Tax. Also, I see Javita here, North Carolina Black Alliance has been with us side by side in fighting for more and better election funding on the county level to shore up what the state will not do. And one more thing, Heba, I would really like to point out is that we have seen that election turnout is tied to this funding. We hear a lot of people talking about voter turnout in North Carolina post 2022. Why was it so low in some areas? Well, that could be correlated directly to election funding. And that means funding needs to be increased not simply on the county level, but not drained by the state coffers on the state level in this budget, which dictates things like the State Board of Elections, that kind of governing body for our county boards. And cuts in the past have meant that, you know, the State Board of Elections has a lot fewer data analysts to keep our voter rolls where they need to be. It has eliminated these positions that ensure security for our elections. And so we'll be watching and advocating not simply at the state level, but the county level to make sure the counties get what they need ahead of the all important elections in 2024.
Thank you so much, Saylor. I'd like to turn it over to you now, Jovita. Your work is focused on many things, but in particular on environmental justice. Can you tell us about how your work, what exactly that means, and break it down for us? What does it mean in terms of our quality of life in the day-to-day of North Carolinians when we don't have an adequate budget and adequate investments?
Absolutely. So thank you so much again for having me be in space today to speak a little bit about the impact, the real-time impact for community in relation to environmental justice. And so thinking about North Carolina as a whole, especially thinking about communities that are most impacted by environmental issues that we see. So a lot of us have heard, you know, we're talking about PFAS, when we're talking about hog waste impact, when we're talking about, you know, natural disasters and 500-year storms that we see every 2 to 4 years here in North Carolina. All of those things are directly impacting our low income and our Black and brown communities at the most. And so because of that, state funding could kickstart or enhance programming that can directly impact daily lives. That's why it's so critical for our state budget to actually support investment in environmental justice protections, because that's the funding that's going to actually impact day-to-day lives. I'll give one example. When we're thinking of food insecurity in North Carolina, thinking about in 2021, this state, North Carolina, was ranked 10th for the hungriest state in the nation. We have 50 states. And so thinking about approximately 1.5 million people in the state of North Carolina at that time were food insecure, and the numbers have not shifted much from 2021 now to 2023. And so thinking about the grant programming that can be produced through the state budget to help support organizations that specifically address food insecurity, that can help support programming and infrastructure that can take place on a local level, thinking about the counties that are experiencing this food insecurity, we can ensure that the process is equitable and actually reaching folks who need those funds the most. But we can't have that process in place if we don't have the funds to begin with. And so that's why it's critically important to make sure that the budget actually thinks about allocation of these funds to support these communities. But not only that, thinking of cumulative impact. I talk about cumulative impact all of the time because we have to think of this from a larger scale. So when we're addressing food insecurity, we're also addressing other environmental issues at the same time. Thinking about one that's on the main stage right now, going back to PFAS contamination. So you can assume that communities that are food insecure, a lot of them are in proximity or fully a part of areas that are also food deserts in North Carolina. So when you're thinking about that being your reality, the access to affordable nourishment, especially when there's no grocery store in sight, where you can purchase fresh produce near your home, your next best option is what? Fast food or food that's in a convenience store for convenience and affordability. Well, guess what? Those items that you get in fast food and the convenience stores, the wrapping, the packaging of that is PFAS. And so you can assume, and there's research that has proven that the PFAS that is present in that packaging can actually seep into the food that you're eating. So now we're consuming PFAS through the food that we eat. We're consuming PFAS through the water that we drink. And it also can be present in other things, or even our clothing, even the materials that we may use, non-stick materials when we're trying to cook meals for our families. And so there's a lot of connection around different areas and different issues in the environmental space that can be addressed even by just addressing one aspect. I just talked about food insecurity, but there was 3 other areas that were impacted by the funding that could be allocated for that specific area. And so these funding sources for one subcategory is important and can help to alleviate burden in another subcategory when we're talking about environmental justice as a whole.
Thank you so much, Jovita, and thank you for the work that you do. I'm going to ask you, Susan, to talk a little bit about funding for our public schools and the day-to-day realities of our parents and kids in North Carolina.
Sure. So first of all, keep in mind that the state budget is the primary funding source for our schools. So picture a school, everything that goes into that building is funded by our state. That's teacher salary, that's our bus drivers, that's our books and curriculum, that's when we say per pupil spending, how much we spend on, that all comes from the state. And that is dictated by our state constitution. So as much as they like to argue with us about that, it is not a conversation, that is constitutional. And so we also have our school buildings and some supplements, and that is a local funding, which is your property taxes. And we have a small bit, usually from the feds. We've had a bigger chunk lately, and that comes into play and is going to come into play as we continue to talk in the coming years. And I think the most frustrating part is that, well, I can have access quite a bit to my school board, who's going to make a recommendation to our county commissioners, who's going to, put forth a, maybe some taxes to promote our schools. I, as an everyday parent, have a hard time really influencing our state, which is, again, the big show, if you will. By the time I get the budget and it's gone through wonderful analysis from you folks and from folks at Every Child and Education Law, and I find out how that impacts me as a parent, it's almost too late. And I definitely don't have time to organize broad masses of people. That's not a reality. So usually we're dealing with things after the fact, and then we're going back to our county commissioner saying, please, please, please supplement what the state didn't do for us, which is property taxes. And again, that's a regressive tax. So it's a really complicated kind of way to look at things. And generally as a parent, you're not going to see the effects until it's hit you. Or you have an enterprising, wonderful school board member who's going to, tell you, hey, there's something really bad in that budget, or you're reading it in the newspaper. It's really hard to get connected to these things as a parent. And I can't emphasize that enough. Until it's impacting your individual child, a lot of times it's hard to organize around these issues too, because it's really hard to see that broad picture. So right now,
Break it
Yeah.
down for us. What does that mean on a day-to-day? Does that mean no buses? Does that mean no teacher for half the year? What does that mean?
Sort of. So it depends on where you live, because the system is inequitable, as I was saying. So for instance, if you're in Wake County and you've begged your county commissioners to please supplement, you might actually have more bus drivers than your neighbor over in Johnston County. So it's hard to describe on a statewide level what the impact might be, because unfortunately, a student in Wake County is going to have a very different experience than a student in Robeson County. And that's the reality. A special education student all over the place is going to have a very different reality than a student in general education. We are having trouble right now just keeping up with teachers in special education. The kids who need the most specialized instruction, with those who have the most experience, we can't keep them employed. And so what that happens is when you hear there's a behavior crisis, no, there's a teacher crisis. That's what's going on. There's a social worker crisis. So when you hear these kind of broad things put on our students, I want you to put a different lens on that. And what's happening with funding is absolutely impacting what we're all seeing and hearing about, and people talking about with our students. Our students are just fine. They're wonderful. Hang out with some students. I'm telling you, hang out with some 13-year-olds. They'll change your life and they'll crack you up. And they'll probably call you cringe, but that's fine. It's the funding that's not coming into our schools and not supporting these children. And they're aware, by the way, they're aware that they have a substitute instead of a math teacher permanently in their classroom. They're aware they're not getting picked up from school. This is not rocket science. We really do have a bus driver shortage. This is a problem all over the place. But right now, our schools are competing with their own towns for bus drivers. Our municipalities, in many ways, are paying our bus drivers more than our school system. And so our bus drivers would rather work for the town of Cary than they would for Wake County Public Schools.
Well, Susan, I'm going to remember that. It's not a student crisis. It's not a behavior crisis. It's a funding crisis.
Correct.
And Reverend Garcia Samson, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please take us home.
Sure. No, Susan, this has been an inspiring conversation so far. And Susan, yeah, the same thing you wrote. This is not a student crisis. This is a behavior crisis. This is a teacher crisis. I think maybe what we've heard today is that this is not a money crisis. This is a leadership crisis at our state level. To recognize across all of our issues that there is a deep, real experience of scarcity of resources that is deeply impacting the lives of our children, our health, our elections across the board. My role, not only as a faith leader, but also as a member of the People's Budget Coalition, is to tell the truth about the narrative, very, very powerful narrative of scarcity in our state right now, and the reality of what's actually going on. Recently I logged on to a PBS show where there was pundits talking about the state budget. I've been in the legislature while people discuss the state budget, and there's such a deep sense of pride about our fiscal responsibility and all the great tax decisions that we're making. And it is heartbreaking and it is infuriating because it's just simply not the truth about what is happening in our state. That we have the leadership of our state is making decisions about taking the people's money and not using it to meet the needs of the people, to cut the people out of the process, so that if we did feel that they're not using our funds correctly, we wouldn't have the mechanisms through which to communicate that. And then to add insult to injury, not only are you taking billions of dollars and putting it into reserve funds, which is a direct failure to take our money and do with it what we need you to do, but then to also immorally shift the tax burden onto those who are most directly impacted and who are already struggling. The People's Budget Coalition is about interrogating the limits of our imagination for what is possible in this state. It's about telling a new story that a different North Carolina is possible. It's inviting people into imagining schools where that beautiful Leandro funding is affirming the worth and dignity of our students. It's about a North Carolina where we are a beacon of democracy and communities coming together to honor the sacred votes of each and every one of us. It's about all of these things. And I think what we are called to do as a broad intersectional coalition, look at the power in this room right here. We all deeply, we know each other. We are in lockstep. We are shoulder to shoulder and know that every single one of our issues are deeply interconnected. And we as a movement are deeply interconnected. And you could not untangle us if you tried. And that is, I think, where my hope comes from. I mean, faith is my business, and not in movement spaces, not a particular theology, but faith in us. Faith that the majority of North Carolinians want healthcare and housing and workers' rights and education and voting rights. And if we can weave together a movement that believes in this different story about North Carolina, that North Carolina can in fact be a place of abundance, can in fact be a place of thriving. And the thing that's stopping us is, one, perhaps being in deep enough relationship, having faith that if we can build this movement, that we will have the power we need. And so I think that's what we are called to do. And one thing I just want to share that I think is a really powerful example of the irony of our state is our state seal, which I don't know if you've ever looked at our state seal.
Yes, I love it.
The state seal, 1971, it was standardized by the General Assembly, ironically. There's a woman named Liberty holding a scroll with the state constitution and holding this Liberty cap, which so ironically for Leandro is a powerful statement made by the General Assembly that our liberty is tied to our allegiance to the state constitution, which they are screwing over every way they possibly can. And then a cornucopia symbolizing the abundance in our state, right? Oh, yes, come on through with that state seal. Look at that. Look at the irony there. And then, of course, this idea that the state motto, to be rather than to seem. Well, from my perspective, to be rather than to seem. We rave about being one of the best places in the country to work. Everyone wants to move here, right? That's what we want people to think about North Carolina. Wrong. Oxfam a few years ago rated us the worst place in the country to work based on wages and worker protections and rights to organize. We are renowned for having world-class educational institutions, but since 1994, and let's tell the truth, far beyond that, we have failed to provide the basic minimum standards for a sound basic education for our children, and that is absolutely shameful. And the General Assembly takes such great pride in our fiscal responsibility, but they are simply failing the people of the state and hoping that nobody notices the billions of dollars that they have tucked away for some sort of rainy day that is obviously completely unrelated to the actual needs of the state, or else in the last few years, we would have seen that money. If this is not the rainy day, then what is? So I am very hopeful that if we can have the faith in our movement, this intersectional movement of people that know the power of our state budget, that know that this is our money, if we can come together and if we can tell a new story, then a new North Carolina is possible, where we have that spirit of abundance in our state seal, where everyone has what they need to thrive.
Thank you so much, Reverend Garcia Samson. Thank you. You've been inspiring. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Susie, right now. You've heard about this sort of false chrysidity of scarcity. She's going to talk to you about how false that is and the things that we could do to improve our process and some more specifics about the process this year. Thank you, Susie.
Yeah, hi everyone. I have the unfortunate role of speaking after Reverend Lisa and such uplifting and hopeful remarks. So I appreciate that very much. As Heba mentioned at the outset, and as you've heard from panelists, the state budget process has become more and more opaque over the past several years in particular. This is the official budget process as outlined in the State Budget Act, and I'm not going to walk through it all, but there are some specific steps in place that you can see. We'll share slides after this webinar, but you can see there's specific steps in place for how the budget is to be created. Some of the process lies with state agencies to determine, what they need to operate. But the legislative process can and really should be transparent and inclusive of the public. So on the next slide, this is the unfortunate reality of the budget process as it currently stands. So typically what happens is the General Assembly leaders decide behind closed doors on an arbitrary spending cap. That really is the first public legislative process to happen, and I can share a link for that in the chat for this year. There is no public space where an analysis is done about how tax decisions will affect the state over the long term. Their final decisions about the budget are made by essentially, leaders of the House and the Senate, sometimes with the governor, as we've seen, particularly in 2019. It was a decisive veto. There's very limited opportunity for legislators to even ask questions and get clarity on what's being included. Even from their perspective as elected leaders to represent us. There's no or limited opportunities for public input. And as has been mentioned, there's really limited review, potentially non-existent review of what the community's needs are and how those needs should be reflected in spending priorities. So during and after each state budget cycle, we often hear that the state has, invested a tremendous amount of money and resources to, various areas of the state budget. We hear that, tax cuts are, the path to prosperity and they've benefited the economy, and that we need as Reverend Lisa mentioned, that we need to put more money away into reserves for some future date. What we know and what we try to set the record on is that spending is in fact not adequate. We can afford to lay a stronger foundation and create more opportunity for everyone, and that tax cuts have really undermined our collective well-being, and they've not delivered the results that have been promised for over a decade. So this is setting the record straight. So here we are now. This chart shows that our state's general fund spending relative to the economy over time. So historically, when you see declines, those represent recessions. Peaks represent robust recovery. But really, in the last 10 years, funding has declined, has fallen well below the 50-year average, despite economic growth. And so you see here where we are now is that the governor has introduced his recommended budget. These two green bars on the far right represent sort of where those proposed spending amounts fall relative to our historic spending. On the next slide is sort of a little bit more about what we know and what has been rumored. So obviously the governor's proposal has been released. As I mentioned, the arbitrary spending cap has also been released and agreed upon by legislative leaders. We're hearing that the House Republican caucus is meeting on the budget today, and this year the House will initiate the budget process. So we've heard some confusing and conflicting rumors about when the budget will be released publicly. I've heard as early as today, potentially Thursday, maybe next week. There's all sorts of hearsay going on about when that will happen. It's clear that they are being very ambitious about trying to advance something before Easter is what we've heard. I'm curious if others have heard differently, but we've also heard that it's going to be released in phases, and the potentially, as they did last year, legislative leaders will sort of quote unquote pre-conference, which is not part of the formal budget process. They will pre-conference on between the House and the Senate and release what they have agreed upon behind closed doors. We're expecting further cuts to income taxes. And as Heba mentioned at the outset, it's very clear that legislative leaders are just continuing and really accelerating the path to zero income taxes. And as I'm sure you all know, the governor yesterday signed the Medicaid expansion bill into law, which is, an enormous victory for everyone, I think, across North Carolina. Unfortunately, it can't be implemented until the state has a state budget enacted. And so we think that, those strings should not be attached. People have been waiting for healthcare. People have been waiting for Medicaid expansion for over a decade. People's lives are and continue to be on the line. And these strings should not be attached. And so we hope to see a budget that advances needs, and we are hoping that it is more transparent than it has been in the past. So with that, I will pass it back to Heba.
Thank you so much, Susie. So you've heard from Susie and I, in recent years, we have this arbitrary spending cap. Our lawmakers have little time to review the budget. There's not enough time for analysis. There's not a real assessment of needs in community. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to, as Reverend Lisa mentioned, we are going to be in league, in cooperation together, and we're going to push back on this. And we're planning to make our concerns well known to our General Assembly members and leadership. And we're planning action to encourage transparency in the budget process so that the needs of all of our communities are reflected. We understand that the budget is about choices, but right now, the real needs in our communities aren't being taken into consideration, and our voice is not present in the process. So if you would like to join this action with us and learn more about what we're going to do and how we're going to push back and how we're going to demand more transparency, please go ahead and put your name and your email in the chat, or Mel has actually put in the chat a place where you can contact your lawmaker right now. But if you want to hear updates from us, please put your name and your email in the chat, and we will be sending information out